Wild geese flying above the water do not intend to cast their reflection. The water has no mind to retain their image, yet the human mind turns nearly every passing moment into something to preserve, revisit, defend, regret, or repeat. What was only passing through experience becomes psychological property. A moment ends, but inwardly it continues. A face disappears, yet the mind keeps speaking to it. A season changes, though part of the self still waits inside it. Much of human exhaustion begins there, yet life moves with extraordinary fluidity. Morning becomes afternoon without resistance. Clouds do not argue with the wind that rearranges them. Rain does not attempt to remain rain after touching the ground. Even the body obeys this law. Cells die and regenerate continuously. Thoughts appear and vanish on their own. Emotions rise, intensify, dissolve, and make room for others. Existence itself operates through movement. Yet the mind develops a habit almost completely opposed to this movement: retention. It retains praise long after the voice that offered it has gone silent. It retains embarrassment with astonishing precision. It retains versions of people who no longer exist. It retains identities formed years earlier, then suffers when reality refuses to match the preserved image. Sometimes a person does not even miss the past itself. They miss the emotional certainty attached to it. The mind confuses memory with continuity, then calls the confusion self. This begins early in life. A child discovers comfort and naturally wishes it to continue. Pleasure arrives, attachment follows. Pain arrives, resistance follows. Over time, the nervous system learns to reach toward what feels desirable and contract against what feels threatening. There is nothing strange about this. It is part of survival. But survival mechanisms become psychological architecture. The mind slowly builds a world made not from reality itself, but from accumulated impressions of reality. It begins living among mental residues. That is why two people can walk through the same day and inhabit completely different worlds. One person experiences an insult in the morning and carries it through the entire afternoon, replaying it repeatedly, strengthening it each time. Another notices the same insult, feels its sting, then allows the moment to end where it ended. Outwardly, the event was identical. Inwardly, one mind kept the reflection, while the other allowed the water to clear. The strange thing is that most of us believe this constant retention is necessary. We fear that without psychological clinging, we would become indifferent, passive, detached from life. But the opposite is often true. Retention dulls experience because it forces the present moment to compete against accumulated mental noise. A person eating a meal is rarely only eating. They are remembering, comparing, anticipating, evaluating, photographing, narrating, and preserving the experience while still inside it. The mind reaches forward to keep the moment before fully living it. Look carefully at how quickly experience becomes possession. Someone receives a compliment and immediately wants another. Someone falls in love and instantly fear enters beside affection. Fear of change, fear of loss, fear that the image currently reflected will not remain stable. The mind does not simply enjoy beauty, it attempts to secure it. Yet anything truly alive changes continuously. This creates tension at the center of human life. The mind seeks permanence within a reality structured around movement. Much suffering grows from that collision. A conversation ends badly. Weeks later, the body still tightens while remembering it. An opportunity disappears. The mind rebuilds alternate versions of the past, imagining different outcomes, different sentences, different decisions. Someone who once knew happiness begins measuring every current moment against a preserved emotional photograph from years earlier. Without noticing it, they stop meeting life directly. They meet memory. Even success can become a burden when psychologically retained. A person admired for intelligence may spend years defending that identity, terrified of failure because failure threatens the reflection they have stored about themselves. Another person once felt deeply loved and now tries desperately to recreate the same emotional atmosphere in every relationship that follows. The past becomes a template imposed upon the present. Life keeps moving. The mind keeps tracing old outlines over new forms. This is why freedom is not merely political, financial, or social. A person may possess external freedoms while remaining inwardly trapped inside old images. Some people leave difficult environments physically, yet continue reliving them psychologically for decades. Others achieve everything they once desired and still remain restless because the mind has turned striving itself into identity. The external conditions changed. The mechanism of retention did not. Observe how often thought behaves like a hand that cannot stop closing. One memory appears. The mind grips it. One fear appears. The mind circles around it repeatedly. One pleasant experience appears. The mind immediately asks how to repeat it. Rarely does consciousness allow anything to arrive and depart completely. Even while listening to someone speak, many people are already storing, categorizing, judging, or defending internally. Their experience becomes filtered through accumulation. Modern digital systems are built around preservation. Photographs, messages, timelines, archives, notifications are all evidence of who we were, what we felt, where we went, and even how others responded to us. We human beings once forgot naturally. Now forgetting almost feels unnatural. The past remains permanently accessible, waiting to be reopened at any moment. A person can revisit an argument from 3 years ago before breakfast. The nervous system rarely receives permission to finish experience completely. And still, beneath all this noise, life continues demonstrating another possibility. The sky never struggles to hold migrating birds. Autumn trees do not panic while releasing leaves. Rivers do not mourn the shape of yesterday's current. Nature participates fully in appearance and disappearance without turning either into psychological drama. There is movement without resistance, presence without possession. We human beings occasionally experience this state unintentionally. A musician becomes so absorbed in sound that self-consciousness disappears for a moment. Someone watches rain against a window and suddenly stops narrating internally. An athlete moves without overthinking. A child laughs without trying to preserve the laughter. In such moments, there is awareness, but not accumulation. Experience passes cleanly through consciousness. Then thought returns and says, "How do I keep this?" The moment tightens immediately. This reveals that freedom is not created by controlling experience more effectively. Freedom appears when the compulsive need to secure experience weakens. The mind assumes peace will come after successful control. That is, once relationships become stable enough, achievements become permanent enough, emotions become manageable enough, and circumstances become predictable enough. Yet control expands endlessly because life itself refuses to become fixed. Nothing stays arranged. People change, bodies age, desires evolve, and certainties collapse. Yet entire phases of life disappear quietly while attention is elsewhere. One day, a person realizes the house they once called home exists now only in memory. The friends they spoke with every day belong to another chapter entirely, and even their own personality has shifted. The realization can feel painful at first because the mind searches desperately for continuity. But another possibility also exists. Perhaps movement was never the problem. Perhaps the suffering came from demanding stillness from a living world. This does not mean becoming cold or detached. Non-retention is not emotional numbness. In fact, clinging often prevents full feeling because fear contaminates experience almost immediately. A person watching a sunset while worrying that the moment will end is not fully watching the sunset. A person in love, while obsessively guarding against loss, is not fully present with love. Psychological grasping divides attention. To let experience pass does not mean refusing to care. It means caring without converting experience into ownership. There is a profound difference between holding and imprisoning. Someone may grieve deeply after losing a loved one. Tears come naturally. Memory returns naturally. Love remains naturally. None of this is the problem. The suffering deepens when grief hardens into permanent identity, when the mind begins constructing an entire self around the retained wound. Then, pain no longer moves. It settles. A reflection becomes frozen on the surface. Many people secretly fear what would remain without their accumulated stories. If old humiliations disappeared completely, who would they be? If past achievements no longer defined them, what identity would remain? If resentment dissolved, what would organize their emotional world? The ego often survives through continuity of narrative. It constantly reconstructs itself from memory. That is why silence can feel uncomfortable. Without constant mental narration, the familiar structure weakens. Some people immediately reach for distraction the moment stillness appears. Music, scrolling, conversation, stimulation, planning. Not because silence harms them, but because silence interrupts the ongoing reconstruction of self through thought. Yet in silence, awareness settles, and awareness itself does not need to cling in order to exist. Thoughts move through it. Emotions move through it. Sensations move through it. The observer remains open enough for all of them to appear without becoming trapped inside them. Like water reflecting the sky, consciousness functions most clearly when not crowded by retention. Watch the mind during irritation. Someone cuts in front of another person in traffic. The event lasts seconds. Yet inwardly, the mind continues the conflict long afterward, replaying the scene repeatedly, adding imagined arguments, strengthening emotional agitation through repetition. The suffering is no longer caused by the event itself. It is sustained through mental continuation. The same pattern appears in pleasure. A person receives admiration and spends the rest of the day replaying the moment internally. The ego feeds on the preserved image. Soon dependence forms. More admiration becomes necessary to maintain the same psychological structure. The mind becomes addicted not only to experiences, but to retained reflections of experiences. This constant accumulation creates heaviness. One can feel it in exhausted conversations where people no longer encounter each other directly. They encounter remembered versions of each other. A single mistake becomes permanently attached to identity. Old arguments remain active beneath ordinary interactions. Relationships become crowded with stored interpretations. Very few people meet each other freshly. Imagine the difference if even briefly the mind stopped carrying every previous image into the present encounter. Listening would change completely. Instead of waiting for confirmation of existing judgments, attention would become alive again. Curiosity would return. Even ordinary moments would regain depth because perception would no longer be buried beneath psychological residue. Children often possess traces of this naturally. They become absorbed quickly because they have not yet constructed such dense internal archives. Anger erupts, then disappears. Joy appears fully, then vanishes fully. Attention moves fluidly. As people grow older, the mind often loses this flexibility. Their experiences accumulate without release. Identity thickens. Reactions become predictable. Because they are not responding to the present moment at all, they are responding from layers of retained memory. This is why freedom can feel strangely unfamiliar at first. Because people are accustomed to carrying themselves heavily. They mistake psychological tension for seriousness, constant mental activity for intelligence, emotional retention for depth. But depth does not require heaviness. The ocean is deep precisely because it allows movement. There is also humility in non-retention. The mind that clings constantly centers itself within experience. It asks, What does this mean for me? How does this affect my identity? How should this be remembered? But moments of genuine openness reduce this self-centered pressure. Experience unfolds without immediate appropriation. The world no longer exists merely as material for ego construction. Walking through a city can become entirely different when the mind is not continuously narrating itself. Sounds become clearer. Faces appear less threatening. Even time changes texture. Minutes stop feeling squeezed between mental projections. Presence expands. This does not happen through force. One cannot aggressively achieve non-clinging because aggression itself becomes another form of grasping. Some people turn spirituality into another possession, another identity to defend, another image to preserve, another standard against which to judge themselves and others. The mind is remarkably skilled at turning even freedom into acquisition. The shift begins when a person notices thought without immediately following it. An emotion arises and is allowed to move without becoming autobiography. A pleasant moment arrives and is fully experienced without the desperate impulse to secure repetition. Little by little, the nervous system learns that existence continues even when experience is not psychologically imprisoned. This changes relationships profoundly. Many forms of conflict emerge from attempts to preserve fixed images of one another. You used to be this. You are supposed to act this way. Why are you changing? Beneath these complaints lies resistance to movement itself, but living beings change continuously. To love someone while refusing their transformation is to love memory more than reality. The same applies inwardly. Many people suffer because they continue identifying with versions of themselves that no longer exist. They preserve old failures long after growth has occurred, or they preserve old successes long after life has moved elsewhere. In both cases, the past dominates perception. Meanwhile, existence continues unfolding only in the present. The irony is that when the mind stops trying to preserve experience so aggressively, experience often becomes more vivid. Colors appear brighter. Conversations feel less filtered. Joy moves more freely because fear of losing it no longer suffocates it immediately. Even sorrow becomes cleaner, painful, yes, but no longer endlessly recycled through mental resistance. There is a softness that enters perception when grasping weakens, not weakness, not passivity. Softness in the sense that water is soft, adaptable, responsive, unbroken by movement. Rigid minds shatter easily because reality constantly violates their demands for permanence. Flexible minds move with change instead of against it. Most people spend enormous energy trying to stabilize what cannot be stabilized: reputation, emotional states, relationships, youth, certainty, identity. Entire lives disappear into maintenance of temporary forms. Yet life was never offering permanence. It was offering participation. The geese cross the sky for a moment. The reflection appears for a moment. Nothing has gone wrong when the image disappears. The disappearance was part of the appearance from the beginning. Seen clearly, this changes even the experience of time. Instead of treating moments as possessions slipping away, one begins meeting them as movements already complete in themselves. A conversation does not need to last forever to be meaningful. A season of life does not become worthless because it ended. Beauty does not require permanence in order to be real. Perhaps much of human sorrow comes from confusing duration with value. A flower blooms briefly. Still, it is fully itself. Music vanishes the moment it is heard. Still, it transforms the listener. Sunlight crosses a room for only minutes. Still, the room is changed by it. Existence has always spoken through passing forms. The mind suffers because it says, stay. Life answers, move. To resist this completely is exhausting. One spends years trying to negotiate with impermanence, trying to secure guarantees from a world built upon transition. Eventually, fatigue itself becomes instruction. People begin realizing that control cannot provide the peace they expected. The tighter the grip becomes, the more fragile everything feels. Then, sometimes quietly, another way of living appears. Not withdrawal from life, not indifference, not forgetting, simply less grasping. A person notices sadness without constructing an entire identity around it. Success arrives without becoming ego architecture. Praise comes and goes. Embarrassment comes and goes. Thoughts come and go. Seasons come and go. Relationships evolve. The body changes. Awareness remains open enough to allow movement. In such openness, there is unexpected freedom. Attention no longer remains trapped in constant preservation and defense. Energy returns to direct living. The ordinary world becomes sufficient again because the mind is no longer endlessly dividing experience into what must stay and what must disappear. The geese were never trying to leave a permanent mark upon the water. The water never begged the reflection to remain. There was only movement, appearance, disappearance, and complete participation in each. We human beings can learn from that simplicity, not by becoming emotionless, but by allowing life to move without converting every passing moment into psychological ownership, not by destroying memory, but by loosening identification with what memory contains, not by escaping reality, but by finally participating in it without constant resistance. Freedom begins there. It begins the moment the mind no longer treats every experience as something to capture and carry forever. It begins when awareness becomes spacious enough for things to arrive and depart naturally. It begins when the past stops occupying the entire field of perception. It begins when presence matters more than preservation. And perhaps that freedom has always been closer than people imagine. One breath appears, another leaves. A sound enters silence, then fades back into it. Light touches water briefly, then disappears. The sky does not cling to the birds passing through it. The water does not mourn the lost reflection, and for a moment, maybe only a moment, the mind becomes still enough to understand why.